Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight, and welcome to the third annual Temple Micah Plan Giving webinar. For those of you I haven't had a chance yet to meet, I'm Beth Werlin. I'm Temple Micah's Executive Director. And I think most of you know, but I joined the team at the end of the summer, at the end of August, and it's been an absolutely wonderful, albeit very busy, first 2 months on the job. And I gotta say, I feel like I hit the jackpot of jobs. Not only do I have a bird's eye view into the brilliance and thought that really goes into all of the services and the programming that the rabbis and the other staff put together, but I've also had a great pleasure to meet so many of the members of our community who really pour their hearts and all of their talents into Micah and make it what it is. It's truly been an overwhelming welcome that I've received, and I've just been so impressed by the level of engagement and leadership within this congregation. And I know you all know this already, which is why you're here, but Temple Micah is truly such a special place because at its core, there are just amazing people co-creating over and over a meaningful Jewish experience in an inclusive Jewish community. But of course, a community like this doesn't exist without the financial commitment of its members. And I want to thank those of you on the webinar tonight, including our panelists who have made Temple Micah a philanthropic priority, and some who've already included Temple Micah in their estate planning. So tonight's webinar is going to provide some practical information for you all about plan giving, why you should consider it, what options there are available to you, what other tax and other financial benefits may be available to you and your families. Our panelists are going to talk about different ways to create a meaningful and lasting legacy that not only enriches Micah's future, but also reflects your commitment and your family's commitment to Temple Micah. I do want to remind you all, you probably saw when you hopped on, that we are recording this event, so we'll make it available to those who aren't able to join tonight. And that reminds me, there are the two previous events, or at least the last year's event, which are available to view as well on our YouTube page, and we'll send out links for those, as well as the slides and any other materials that we have related to the program after the program as well. So for the next hour plus, a little bit plus, I'm going to invite our panelists each to speak for a few minutes. At the end of the presentations, we'll have about probably at least 15 to 20 minutes for question and answers. You can type your questions right into the chat. They will be going directly to the hosts of the call. At the end of it, we will make sure we'll try to address all of the questions that we get in. I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a moment, but before I do that, I just want to make sure I've introduced two other members of the Temple Micah staff who are on this webinar tonight. First, Sue Alpern-Fish, who I think most of you probably know from her many years serving and leading Temple Micah's fundraising efforts. She is the mastermind behind this webinar and really worked closely with the development committee headed by Deborah Notman to put together the content for this program. So thank you, Sue, for organizing this very important event. The other person I want to be sure to introduce, who I think is probably in the upper left-hand corner, is Hannah Ruth Wellins. She is Temple Micah's development associate. She joined the team over the summer and is the person at the Temple Micah office now who is tracking and managing all of the pledges and donations that come in, among other development responsibilities. So she's a go-to person in the office if you have any questions about any donations that have been made. She's also going to be managing the questions that come in today during our webinar and facilitating the Q&A. So thank you so much, Hannah Ruth, for helping to make this possible. And now on to our panelists. We have an excellent lineup of Temple Micah members who are sharing their professional expertise as well as their personal experiences tonight. First, I'd like to introduce Noel Salinger. He joined Temple Micah back in 2010 and has served on the development committee since 2015. He also joined the Micah board this year. He retired from his professional responsibilities in 2018 after a 40-plus year career in development, working at the National Office of the ACLU, University of Chicago, DW Medical Center and the Smithsonian. As a senior manager of multiple fundraising teams, excuse me, he has been responsible for managing plan giving programs at several large institutions. Next, I'd like to introduce Gail Pogbar and Larry Bockerich. Close.
Perfect.
Yeah. Well, I'll keep at it. Gail is a general internal medicine physician. In addition to teaching fourth grade at Temple Micah's Sunday school for about 11 years, she also served on the Temple Micah board for 6 years, where she actually initiated the conversations about having an endowment back in the late 90s. So thank you very much, Gail, for that. Larry has a PhD in English, but after a year or two teaching part-time in area universities, he went on to become a speechwriter and a writing teacher for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. He later became the head of public affairs there. Larry also served for 2+ terms on the Micah board. And Gail and Larry, although now retired, are very active in the Temple Micah community, including regularly participating in Temple Micah clubs. Next, we have Oren Goldberg. Oren has been a member of Temple Micah along with his wife and 2 daughters since 2014. He's been on the Temple Micah's Plan Giving Committee since 2019. He's of counsel at the law firm of Basternack and Fittis in Bethesda, where his practice is focused on planning and administration of estates and trusts. He advises clients on personal and financial legacy planning, business succession, asset protection, and charitable giving, with particular attention to family cohesion, conflict avoidance, and tax efficiency. His older daughter, Hannah, was bat mitzvahed at Micah during the pandemic in April 2020, and his younger daughter, Ellie, will be part of the 22-23 B'nai Mitzvah class. Next, we have Jim Hamos. He and his wife, Andrea, have been members for 12 years at Temple Micah. He just recently completed a 6-year term on the Micah board and has been a longstanding member of the Development Committee and the Finance Committee and is actively involved with Sukkot Shalom. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce David Wentworth, who, along with his wife, Betsy Broder, have been active members at Temple Micah since 1991. Their 2 daughters, Ariel and Caroline, each celebrated their bat mitzvah at Temple Micah. David has twice chaired the Finance Committee. He is a member of the Board of Directors currently and serves as Micah's treasurer. He also plays clarinet in the Micah pickup band. So we have a pretty star-studded lineup here, lots of great insights that I know this panel is about to provide. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Noel to talk for a little bit about an overview of plan giving.
Thank you very much, Beth. And before I start, I really want to acknowledge Beth for all the great work she's done for the temple. It's hard to believe it's only been 2 months, but I've worked with her in this capacity in planning this. I've worked with her on the board, a couple of other things, and I got to tell you, the temple is in good hands. So thank you, Beth, for your commitment to development, for one thing, your commitment to the temple generally, and for all your support and work on this program. So I'm leading off to sort of get us into the topic. I'm going to start by saying something that you're probably going to hear several times this evening, because I think it's true for many of us. Temple Micah has been a really important part of my life, has been for the last 10 or 11 years. I joined after I started Merrill Wiener's 2009 adult B'nai Mitzvah class. David is nodding because Betsy was in that class. We were called to Torah in April of 2011, and it was, I don't know, just one of those sort of spiritual days, magical spiritual days. And to this day, each summer, usually Betsy and I and a couple of others from that class during the lay-led services in the summer chant Torah and Haftarah in Merrill's honor. And it's just a wonderful way to acknowledge her contribution to our worship experience. So, you know, I'm a regular Saturday Torah study guy. I've been a regular Saturday morning worship attendee, certainly before the pandemic. And it's actually, I mean, it's just so wonderful that now we are able to return to the sanctuary for worship services on Saturday. So I'm really grateful to be part of this community. And I'm telling you this not because I think anybody should be interested in my autobiography, which isn't really very much longer than that, but to make the point that these experiences that are so important to me make me a beneficiary of the financial generosity and commitment to this community of many, many members of Temple Micah over many decades. If it weren't for those gifts, if it wasn't for that commitment, we wouldn't have our just fabulous Robert Weinstein designed sacred space. We wouldn't have our wise, thoughtful clergy. We wouldn't have the leadership of our staff, our inspiring music, or our innovative programming. All of that is due to the financial support of members of our community. But it wasn't always so. Some of you on this call, I think probably Sid and Elka, Nancy, Martha perhaps know far better than I do that in the early years of the temple, it was often touch and go, kind of mouth to mouth financially. And in the beginning, it was not a foregone conclusion that the temple would survive, let alone become a leader in American Reform Judaism. So the temple really was fragile in its first years, but our founding patriarchs and matriarchs, if I can call them that, dug deep into their pockets, and the staff and clergy watched the pennies turn into dollars over time. I think you're all with us this evening because we don't want to see a fragile future like our fragile past. We want to see a very strong, vibrant, creative future. And as one big part of that, the board and staff have started this planned giving program to help lay a stronger foundation for the future. So I want to start by just giving a very brief overview of what planned giving is, and it's really simple. Loosely defined, this is my loose definition, this is what I call midrash. Planned giving is simply a way to plan for your personal, simply a way to use assets other than your checkbook to give to Temple Micah. Many, but not all, of your planned gifts are made after your lifetime. And of course, tonight we're focusing on a particular way of planning a gift that you make currently. So I want to conclude this introduction with a handful of simple takeaways that I hope you'll bear in mind during our discussion tonight. First, I think you'll get the idea through this presentation. Planned giving is easy. There are certainly lots of complicated, esoteric planned gifts, trusts, and various things that Oren is an expert on. But in fact, the vast majority of what we call planned gifts to any charitable organization are bequests, gifts made through your will or through designations of retirement plans. Those are actually the two most common planned gifts that are made in this country, and they're easy to do. In fact, not to quote an old Geico commercial, which may actually be politically incorrect for cavemen, it's so easy that even I could do it. Although I did it not because it's easy, I did it because I wanted to. And earlier this year, I designated a portion of my my TIA account to Temple Micah. And hopefully they won't see it for a couple of decades. Number two, You do not have to be a zillionaire to make a meaningful planned gift. Gifts of any size are great because over time, the cumulative effect of many planned gifts adds up and is one of the things that really provides financial stability for Temple Micah. 3, many people discover when they start thinking about how to make a planned gift that they can make a much larger gift than they could if they just wrote a check to the annual fund or to the auction, because you're using a different kind of asset. When I was, when I was working in this business, one of the things you would hear at the, at the fundraising conferences where they would sort of teach you how to really get the most out of your donor, they would say, tell your donor to give until it hurts. And I say planned giving is a way to give until you feel great about it. 4, you can consider a planned gift at your own pace. There is no rush. Take the time to consult a trusted professional to make a plan that makes the most sense, that works the best for you financially. There are tax advantages to certain kinds of gifts, and you should be aware of what's going to be most beneficial to you as you make a gift. And finally, and I think this is really, really important, when you start thinking about this, I think it's really important that you have a conversation with everybody else who has an interest in your estate, family members, other beneficiaries, so that they know what your plan is and that they support your plan, and so that that they will honor your wishes when the time comes. And so I hope you learn a lot tonight. Oren has got a really interesting talk, and Jim is going to share some simple ways that you can support the synagogue. And so with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Beth.
Thanks so much for kicking us off with that overview. Before we get into some of those more specifics you just referenced, we're going to actually hear from Gail and Larry, who are going to tell us a bit about why they decided to include Temple Micah as a priority in their plan giving and in their experience in doing so.
Thank you very much. I'm going to kick this off for us and appreciate the opportunity to speak about our experience. And I'd like to begin with a confession. When we came to town in the late 1970s, finding a congregation was not a high priority for me. I was mostly indifferent to organized religion, often wary of it, and maybe even sometimes hostile to it. But it was an important thing for Gail and for me to find. And after many false starts, we discovered Temple Micah, and we're so grateful and delighted that we did. It literally really changed our lives. We found it a vibrant community, people involved intellectually, and in many other ways. It was just an intellectually challenging place, and we threw ourselves into it. And as I think Noel alluded to earlier, I mean, you almost had to in the early days get involved, or not very much would happen. And it's been important to our now adult children, and now even to our grandchildren. We have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old grandson, and they're in Silver Spring, and they're already participating in the Temple Micah tradition. Just a couple of thoughts on how important Temple Micah has been and why we cherish it so much. Over the 40-some years that we've been in the DC area, whenever we were offered a new job, Gail especially, not so much me, but whenever there was a new job available, we weighed the possibilities and the pros and cons. And one of the major reasons we did not move from this area is our relationship and our connection to Temple Micah and the Temple Micah community. And that shows you how much being members of our congregation means to us. The only other little story I will tell is that after we'd been members for 25 years, I was drafted to be the representative of the new inductees to the 25-year club at Temple Micah. So I had to give a few remarks at Friday night services. And I commented on the egalitarian nature of the congregation, how people treated each other respectfully, regardless of where they were from or what they did. But more important to me was, in this town of Washington, D.C., there are many Temple Micah members that I'd known for decades, and I still didn't know what their day jobs were. And that's remarkable in Washington, D.C. So we just knew them as fellow congregants, really involved, vibrant, intellectually active people, and that's important too. So just to conclude my portion, when we think of our legacies, we want to make sure that we do our part to help ensure that the Micah experience that has so enriched our lives remains available to many in our children's generation and to their children's, and so on. Thank you.
So I grew up in a Reformed Jewish doubting household. My dad and mom actually considered joining a Unitarian congregation because they were so put off by the mainstream reform and conservative options in Providence, Rhode Island, which was the nearest Jewish community to where I grew up. They ultimately created, that with a group of like-minded people, their own congregation. And I fell away from Judaism when I went to college because there was nothing like that there. It was just the same old, same old. So when Larry and I started dating and then got married, my mom was a person who'd left Nazi Germany. My dad's family left pogroms. I wasn't interested in not being Jewish, but I really was very unwilling to settle. And so we bounced. And we knew we were in the right place when we came to Temple Micah one morning, and Danny was running around in a t-shirt and jeans. And everybody, and it was utter chaos. This was in Southwest. And I mean, there were chairs being moved around, and all the classrooms were divided by blackboards, movable blackboards. And we realized that everybody there was participating and nobody was judging someone else's outfit or pocketbook. And it was immediately evident there was no caste system based on whether you were a doctor or a community organizer. Everyone was welcome, and everybody's contributions were valued because they'd made a contribution, not because of the size of it or the covet involved. And that was so different from what I had seen in the traditional models. So that was important. The second thing that was important was the irreverence. The fact that it was okay for my kids to laugh at a Friday night service when Danny made some kind of almost ununderstandable joke, or Teddy played a jazz riff in the middle of Hashkivenu, and that was welcomed. You know, that it wasn't sort of like, oh, go to the child's room now. If they got really noisy, yeah, they had to shut up and they had to go go to the quiet room. But if they laughed, that was fine. In fact, laughter was part of what I think of when I think of Temple Micah. When I taught Sunday mornings, again, chaos. Even when we moved to Wisconsin Avenue, it was chaos in the morning. It was laughter. It was people bumping into each other, moving things around. As Danny said, we are always on the brink of disaster, and that's how he wants it, in a good way, in the best way.
Except for financial disaster.
Right. So we take seriously what it matters to take seriously. I think Noel talked about the education. Larry talked about the intellectual challenges. I mean, the superficialities are ignored, but the deep stuff, what values, community, intellectual questioning were really, I mean, that mix was just intoxicating in the best way. But you can't do that if you're not financially secure. And we recognize that. I mean, we like the risk taking. We like the breaking if it's not broken mentality. But if you're not financially secure, it's hard to do that. You become very aware of the guardrails and fear of offending someone and fear of failure. And we want Temple Micah to continue to be irreverent, to laugh, to take risks, to ask hard questions and welcome the questions. And that's why we've talked about and have put Temple Micah in our will, because I don't want this congregation and its commitment to chaos to go away.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Very, very beautiful, beautiful words and inspiring. I hope to all hear, certainly to me. We're now going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to turn it over to Oren, who's going to talk for a little bit longer than our first two panelists about some of the basics of plan giving and some of the tools and strategies that are available to you all, including using donor advised funds as a way to think about your plan giving strategy. So Oren, hand it over to you.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you everyone for joining with us this evening. I know there are lots of things that you can be doing, and we at Micah and everyone in our community really appreciates anything that can be done to, as Gail said, just help ensure the longevity of our great community. I have my own stories about what brought me to Micah, some along the similar paths of searching and bouncing around. And as mentioned earlier, I have two young daughters, and I really hope that Micah is going to be a home for them, that they'll be able to return to Micah as a place of comfort and knowledge as they grow up and start their own families. And it's we all know that it's a unique community, and just like everything else in life that we cherish, it takes a lot to preserve that, so that we're not the only ones who can enjoy it, and that those that come after us can enjoy it as well. So whether you give until it hurts or give until it feels great, every gift matters. A gift of $100 matters. A gift of $1,000 matters. Gifts greater and lesser matter, because there are a lot of different ways that our community can take advantage of your gifts, and those continue to change and evolve over time, and will continue to do so as the interests of our community and the priorities of our community might change. So we all know that we, receive appeals to give during our lives to any number of different organizations. And if you've made charitable gifts, and if you have paid attention to your taxes, then you know that there are income tax deductions that go along with lifetime giving, and there are deductions that come later as well. And sometimes you might benefit from a large charitable deduction, but you might not be ready to hand over all the money to one or more charities right away. And that's one area where donor advised funds fit into the planning, and I'll get to more than that in a bit. But I want to just touch on, what it shows in the slide. Why give after death? You're not going to be around. You're not going to be able to see what your donating organization does with the money, and you might, but I have no evidence that you'll all be able to we'll all be able to see what happens after we're gone. So on the assumption that we're not going to know what happens with after we're gone, why are we giving after death? Well, we give after death because it's really, I think of it as the last time, the last opportunity to influence our family and demonstrate to our family the importance that we place on being a member of a greater community. When you make am I still there?
Yeah, Oren, you got very soft. Is it possible for you to speak more into the microphone?
It is, but I'm having some technical difficulty. My whole screen. Oh, now it's back. My whole screen went black for a second. I apologize for that. I'll speak up a little bit. I apologize for that. So when you make a gift at death, as I was alluding to, it's your last chance to show your children, your grandchildren, how important it is to you to be a part of a community, and that giving is something really important. And most people think, well, I worked really hard for everything that I have during my life, and when I'm gone, I want my kids and my grandkids to be able to continue enjoying this. But hopefully your kids are grown, and even your grandkids are grown, and hopefully we've raised our children well, and they've raised our grandchildren well, and they're all going to be contributing members of society themselves. So they probably don't need every last dollar that we've accumulated in our bank accounts, in our investment accounts, in our retirement accounts. They don't need every last dollar of value in our home. And the amount that we decide to not give our descendants and to give to our communities has a really almost disproportionate effect. Your children will notice the small amount that they didn't get far less than Micah will notice the amount that they received. So I think that's when I think about giving after death, I think that it's a great way to make our legacy about more than just money and stuff. I think that we are all going to be remembered by our children and our grandchildren and our community much longer and more positively if they see that we've given back to our community that made us and supported us. So moving forward, giving at death, what does that do for us other than this influence on our family? Well, when you die, you have an estate, and your estate may or may not go through probate, depending on how you title your assets. Any assets that you own in your individual name will likely be part of your probate estate. Retirement assets and life insurance typically will not be. Those assets will transfer at death by a beneficiary designation that's on file with the retirement plan administrator or the life insurance company. Banking and investment accounts can also pass outside of probate via a beneficiary designation. Those are sometimes referred to as transfer on death or pay on death designations. That's another way to do it. But for the most part, everything is going to be passing under the terms of our will or a trust that we create. And everything that we control at death, whether it passes under a will or a trust or by beneficiary designation or otherwise, that's all included in what's known as the taxable estate, which may or may not be subject to estate tax. Well, for federal purposes, the estate tax laws are in flux. At the moment, there is an awful lot of money that you can transfer to anyone you wish without any federal estate tax, $11.7 million per person pegged to inflation. But that amount's going to get cut in half at the end of 2025. And I hope most of us are going to be around after 2025. And Congress was signaling just last week that they might cause the exemption to get cut in half as soon as next year. We still don't know what might happen. But more importantly, I think the majority of people in our community live in DC or in Maryland, and the District of Columbia and Maryland both have their own state or district estate tax. DC last year lowered the DC estate tax exemption to $4 million. So to the extent that you have assets of $4 million or more, your estate is subject to DC estate tax at a 16% rate. To the extent, if you live in Maryland, then the exemption is $5 million. And to the extent that you have assets above $5 million, those assets will be subject to Maryland estate tax at essentially a 16% rate. So the 16%, or if you're subject to federal estate tax of 40%, and if we are subject to both, then it's probably a combined rate of 50%. Rather than having that money go to the federal government or the District of Columbia or the state of Maryland, if you make charitable gifts part of your estate plan, you can receive an unlimited estate tax charitable deduction. So a lot of people say, well, maybe I'll give my children $4 million. And what's above and beyond that, I can give to charities, because the district doesn't need the money, and Micah and maybe my alma mater and maybe some other organizations locally can really benefit from that money. So just the last thing to touch on with this slide that's on screen right now is the ways that we give. There's joint ownership, another way to avoid probate, which I neglected to mention earlier. If you have a home or a bank account, an investment account that is titled jointly with another person, then that other person will become the owner of that asset after your death. And there's the beneficiary designation, there is a trust, or there is a will. If you already have a will in place, it's really quite easy to update your will and add Micah. There's no reason to go back and start from scratch on your plan. Creating an amendment to your will, or if your plan is really governed by a trust, creating an amendment to your trust is rather simple. It's typically just a few pages where you say your attorney will draft a document that says, I hereby amend this section of my will or my trust to provide as follows. And so having a plan, an estate plan that's already in place, if it does not already include any charitable giving, you shouldn't let that stand in the way of adding Micah to your plan. So that's sort of the basics, but let's talk a little bit more about donor advised funds specifically. And so Beth, maybe switch to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what's a donor advised fund? I don't know whether you've heard this term before. It's basically a charitable savings account. It lets you make a present charitable gift that gives you an immediate charitable deduction, but it allows you to remain involved with your charitable giving for the long term, and to direct distributions out of this fund to organizations that you support, specific causes that you might support over time. In addition, it allows you to name successor advisors. So where I talked earlier about influencing your children and grandchildren to give as well, you can create a donor advised fund and name one or more of your children or even grandchildren to be the successor advisors. And then when you no longer are advising how distribution should be made, these successors step into your shoes and they can then manage that. So it's something that's very easy to set up. It's very flexible over the long term. It promotes family giving, and we like that. You set up a donor advised fund at a sponsoring organization. There are lots of organizations that do this. If you have your investments with Fidelity, Schwab, Vanguard, UBS, any number of financial institutions, these financial institutions, for the most part, will have a charitable wing where you can set up a donor advised fund. There also are various community foundations where you can set up a donor advised fund. Locally, we have the Greater Washington Community Foundation, which is a great organization because they really have their finger on the pulse of the needs in our local community. If you set up a fund at Fidelity, the folks at Fidelity that you work with to develop your giving plan may be focused on national charities. On the other hand, the Greater Washington Community Foundation is really going to be focused on lots of smaller local organizations, including Micah, including some of the other organizations that Micah works with, for the underwear drive and things like that. So I like staying. So personally, I like staying local on that side. But you set this up, and every organization has different minimums. For some organizations, it might be as little as $5,000. For other organizations, it might be significantly higher. The organizations that tend to have higher minimums also tend to have higher operating costs. There's going to be some costs involved with setting up the donor advised fund because the fund sponsor is going to be managing the investments. You're going to be putting money into this fund, and then you're going to be required to direct a minimum percentage of the fund to be distributed each year. It's typically 5%. And the rest of the money in the fund gets invested. And so just like these companies want to charge you investment fees for managing your retirement assets or your investment accounts, they need to get paid for managing the investments in the fund. But they also do all of the legwork, which is terrific. When you're selecting charities other than Micah, you might not know as much about how the funds that you give are being managed and spent by the recipient organization. So the sponsor organization does the legwork. They're going to be checking on the various organizations to ensure that that they are actually spending the money to support the charitable goals and charitable purposes that you wish to support. And that also gets back to why a donor advised fund. Why give to this fund and not give immediately to the charity? Well, at Micah, there are different funds that you can direct your gifts into. And the different funds might be used for different purposes. These purposes might change over time. And if you are giving to a donor advised fund, then you can choose each year whether you want to support the general fund, whether you want to support Sukkot Shalom, whether you want to support something else. And so I like that flexibility in planning for a longer term impact. And you don't need to just give to the fund during your life. You can name your fund as a beneficiary under your will. You can name the fund as a beneficiary of your retirement assets, your life insurance, the same way that you would name an individual beneficiary. So just going full circle, you've created a vehicle where you have named some charitable purposes. You work with the sponsor organization to focus how you want your giving over time to be made. And then they can assist you and also your successor advisors in ensuring that your legacy, that the purposes that you wish to support continue to being supported over time. So what else do they do? What else do these sponsors do? They keep track of all the records. When you're making charitable gifts, there's a lot of record keeping, a lot of papers that you need to keep track of to provide to your CPA or tax preparer at the end of the year. By giving to a donor advised fund, you simplify that because you're making your charitable gift to a single organization, and then the money is being distributed out from there. So it simplifies your record keeping. There's a lot of flexibility in what you can give. There are certain things that you can easily give to any charity: cash, marketable securities, even real estate. Some, cars. We see commercials and hear commercials on the radio. To donate your used car, donate your old boat. A lot of organizations cannot accept those gifts. A lot of organizations cannot accept gifts of closely held business interests, cannot accept gifts of artwork and various other types of tangible or intangible assets. The donor advised funds, because they are larger organizations, because they are public charities, they can accept these gifts and either hold on to it, or liquidate it, and do things that Micah, for example, might not be able to do. Micah is not going to be able to accept a gift of artwork. So it's very flexible. You maximize your charitable deduction in a way that you couldn't by giving to other types of organizations that you'd be able to control over time, like a private foundation or a charitable trust, which is much more fixed and rigid. So we get that flexibility. The last thing I would say, just to remind everyone, there are the costs involved with the donor advised fund, but they're going to be less if you have an interest in giving, but you're not entirely sure about how you want that to be spent over time. The costs of a donor advised fund are going to be significantly less than other things that you might think about doing, including charitable trusts, private foundations, or setting up your own charity. With that, I think I'll wrap up and turn it back over to Beth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oren. And I know there's a lot more there, and hopefully during the Q&A, we'll have a chance to maybe ask some more specific questions to dig into a bit of that. But that was a very, very helpful overview of options, and particularly donor advised funds. So thank you. I'm actually going to turn it next to Jim, who's going to talk a little bit about how this would play out with Temple Micah specifically, and what some of the funds at Temple Micah are, and how to think about your giving with respect to Temple Micah very specifically.
Thank you very, very much, Beth. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is the direct part at Temple Micah. And we ask you to really, in whatever method that you've heard about from Oren and others, is to limit your gifts to Micah in one of four ways. One is what we call unrestricted. And this means that it's as simple as, if you make a gift to Temple Micah, it's considered unrestricted. There's no other part to it. If you just put in your will or you listen to a beneficiary of an IRA, it comes to Temple Micah, it's considered unrestricted. And I'll tell you, it's up to the Temple Micah board then to make a decision about where to place those dollars. But then we do have three other funds that we suggest to you. One is an endowment fund. So we do have a true endowment fund, the sort of thing you hear of that are very quite large at universities or hospitals, other sorts of large systems. Our endowment fund, after our 50 plus years, is incredibly small. In fact, those of us who started thinking about planned giving many years ago actually always thought about the idea of us having a large endowment, but we don't. We have an endowment that's in the tens of thousands. It's a true endowment, which means that any money that's put into it, the principal cannot be spent anytime, and that only up to 5% a year can be spent by the Temple Micah board. To think about that, we also have a legacy fund, which is a quasi-endowment. And what we mean by that is we've written special language that still considers this as an endowment that we want to last and grow, and it has been growing over the last years, but that it has the option for the board with a large, in an exigent need, can go into those funds and use them. So imagine the roof falling down or some large expense that there's no savings for, where the Micah board would then come back to the community and explain why it would go into legacy fund. And so it has a little bit more of a flexibility than the true endowment. And then the fourth fund that we talk about are innovation funds. And these are, the innovation fund was started several years ago. It's seeded ideas like the Haftorah project and the Storefront project. And again, it's up to the board that looks at requests to use these funds to make decisions throughout. And so what we really are asking for you is, as you think about giving, that you think about limiting your gift to one of these four ways, either totally unrestricted, just Temple Micah in general, the endowment fund, the legacy fund, or the innovation fund. You should always know that the Temple Micah board is the fiduciary of all funds that come into the synagogue. So they're, being on the board and understanding how they spend dollars is very, very important. That up to now, the board has never used any gift that's come into Micah because our financial situation is strong. It's not actually used any of the endowment fund or the legacy funds to truly fill any expense needed at Temple Micah. So they've been allowed to grow. Whenever an unrestricted gift has come in in the last few years, the board has actually made a decision to put half into the legacy fund and half into the innovation fund. And the innovation fund you've heard about, that it seeded some of the great ideas that make us a model for modern American reform around the country. People do ask us constantly that, well, can I give you gifts of property, artwork, or furniture? And the answer, and I think Oren just alluded to this, we don't accept these kinds of gifts. And the reason is we just don't have the infrastructure. We don't have either the people or the space for such gifts. If you have such an item that you want the proceeds of it to come to Micah, then we ask that you really put in your will specifically how you ask the trustee of your estate to sell the item and then have the proceeds come to us, but not the direct items themselves. On the right side of this, you see some sample kinds of language. This is also on the development page on the Micah board site, and you can see it gives you the option to, if you're putting it, especially if you're putting these into wills, to more specifically make a decision about one of the four funds that I mentioned. And then finally, the last point that I want to make is about a statement of intent form. The next slide, please, Beth. And what you see is we have the statement of income form. I believe you could download it from the website or ask Sue or Hannah to mail one to you. And what is the statement of intent form? It's number one, it's non-binding. And what it does is it helps us understand where you want to direct your gifts. You don't need to fill it all out if you don't want to put the amount in, but it's really our way of knowing ahead of time and to help ensure that what your intentions are what will be honored. So please think about filling out the intent of the statement of intent. Is it absolutely required to use this form in terms of giving us a gift? The answer is absolutely not. It's not critical. And really, the idea of filling out such a form is that it's useful for the temple to be aware and to actually make easy connections with your trustees and lawyers when the time comes. So that's my part. So I will turn it back to Beth and be ready to answer any questions you might have.
That was great. Thank you so much, Jim. Lastly, I'm going to turn it over to David to close out our panel. And, David, as we mentioned, is the treasurer of Temple Micah, and I think he's going to bring the treasurer's perspective a bit in his closing remarks.
Thanks very much, Beth, and thanks to my fellow panelists for coming before me. I'm going to take just a few moments to talk about the forest, not the trees, and to add one additional thought. It sort of goes without saying that the money is important at Temple Micah. I just want to put that in context. Whether someone contributes dues or contributes fundraising, one way or the other, it supports Temple Micah. So the distinction between the two is slightly arbitrary. But that said, the operations we have grown dramatically in recent years. We used to be, as Larry and Gail said, a rather fragile organization financially. I'm pleased to say that we are no longer that. And it's certainly not because I'm treasurer. I'm just happen to be the guy that pays attention to it right now. But we're in pretty good shape. But we are now a fairly large organization with an annual expenditures between $2 and $2.5 million. The bulk of that money comes from dues, but we have to depending on how it varies from year to year, depending on how much dues we get and so on and so forth. But in general, something like 20% of our budget most years comes from annual fundraising, which is a different subject than planned giving, because if you're talking about planned giving, we're not going to get that money for a while. So I'm now sort of focusing a little bit on the shorter term. And whether you increase your dues or make a contribution as part of fundraising, again, it's the same amount of money. But that's the way the temple functions financially, and that's critical to making the temple run. There is a way to use donor-advised funds, which is really critical for that annual giving need. And I want to take just a moment to talk about that, because Oren focused primarily or almost on the long-term sort of bequests from estates. I won't get into the weeds, but I'm happy to do so with anybody that wants to talk about it. But the big picture is that since almost the beginning of the income tax, charitable contributions have been tax deductible. We also take that as a given. But the 2017 Tax Act made such a change in the standard deduction that unless you're a very wealthy person giving very large amounts of money, the chances are very good that your charitable deduction is in fact no longer tax deductible. If you're giving hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, most of that is tax deductible. But most of us on this call, I'm guessing, are not in a position to write checks quite that large. If you're giving $5,000 or $10,000 or even $20,000 a year, there's a very good chance that money is no longer tax deductible, because the standard deduction is so big. It's a better deal for you just to take the standard deduction and not itemize, unless you have unusual circumstances these days. So the donor advised fund can be a really helpful tool for annual giving. And the game plan is quite simple. If you're going to give $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 total, not just to us, but to whatever charities you support, take 2 or 3 or 4 years and put of your planned giving. It's not planned thinking about your estate, but planning for the next handful of years when you're still very much alive, put it into a donor advised fund. The year in which you put it in a donor advised fund, it's a tax deduction because the contribution would be large enough that it would get substantially larger than the $25,000 married filing jointly standard deduction. And then in the other years, take the standard deduction. And the net impact is you have a much better tax position than if you simply give the $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 every year. And anybody who wants to work out the math with me, I'm happy to show you. It's very straightforward. And donor advised funds have sort of skyrocketed in recent years, in large part for exactly this reason. And you don't have to, you can, all the things that Oren was saying about the flexibility and the advantages of managing fund through the donor advised funds is true, whether you're giving it the way I'm suggesting or whether you're giving into a donor advised fund from your will, one way or the other. But it's another piece of the puzzle that's important to Temple Micah in terms of finances. And that's really all I have to say. I'm happy to answer any detailed questions along with everybody else. Thank you, Beth, and thank you, fellow panelists.
Thank you very much, David, for everything you do. And thank you to all of the panelists. This is really a fantastic discussion. And I know there are some questions, so I'm not going to say too much right now, but I know people will be dropping off soon. So just as a reminder, if you wanted to listen to this again, we'll have it posted. We'll follow up with an email with information that was discussed today. And you can always feel free to reach back out to me, to Hannah, Ruth, and to Sue with any questions you may have. And with that, I'm actually going to turn over to Hannah Ruth, who has a couple of the questions that came in through the chat.
All right, thank you all. The first question is on donor advised funds. Is there a minimum contribution amount required to initially set up a donor advised fund?
So yes and no. It really depends on the sponsor organization. You should expect that there is some minimum, no matter where you set it up. Even if one is not imposed, there ought to be a minimum before it makes sense to do it. But this is something to discuss with the sponsor organizations that you're considering setting up your fund at. What are their minimums?
Great, thank you. Another question, does Virginia have an estate tax? I know we talked about DC and Maryland estate taxes. We had a question about Virginia specifically.
I'll take that one as well. I didn't mention Virginia because no, Virginia does not have a state estate tax. Virginia does, however, have a rather cumbersome probate administration process, but that's a separate topic.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Oren. This is another donor advised fund question. Is the taxable portion of the estate reduced by the amounts designated to be transferred on death going to charitable/religious organizations?
Yes, if I'm understanding the question correctly, then yes. You get a dollar for dollar deduction on the estate for the charitable gifts.
And just to clarify, that's true whether you give the money directly to the charity or whether you give it to the charity via the donor advised fund.
Correct.
And one last question. Why is it important for Temple Micah to know about any planned giving in one's will? How does that information figure into budgeting and other planning at the temple?
So I guess I'll hop onto that one. That it's up to now, planned giving has not fit into the annual budgeting. So this is very, very much future thinking. As David said, a portion of our budget is always part of the pledges plus appeals that we do throughout the year, and those have been sufficient to really fill the needs of the community. So in terms of the annual budgeting, it's just not been part of the story. And in terms of, as I mentioned, it's not critical that we know it ahead because it's not part of annual planning. It's more for making an easy transition at the time of of a gift, about understanding who trustees are, who are the lawyers involved. What is it? Is it an IRA benefit? Gift? Is it a will? What have you? So that's where it's helpful.
Great, thank you. Those were the, we have one more. Is the board not allowed to fund the endowment from unrestricted bequests?
I'll chime in. If the money is unrestricted, by definition, the board can do with it as the board chooses to do. The trade-off with endowments always is that we all like to have a huge endowment for sure, but a gift to endowment is by definition a gift that doesn't fund something right this minute, it funds something in the future. So when unrestricted funds come in, it's a complex conversation the board has to have about where to spend it, but there's no restriction. It could put the money into the endowment if it chose.
Great, I'm just gonna pull up our final slide. Does anybody have any questions, any further questions? All right, I will pull up that slide.
Actually, Henry, can you go to the one before? Are you able to go back a slide? Just want to. So we will share this as well. We do have a planned giving brochure that we can share that's printed, as well as I'm sure we must have a PDF of it, which we will share, but this is what it looks like. You can grab one at Temple Micah when you're there. Hopefully soon we will see each other in person. There's just some links here also. When we provide this electronically, you'll be able to access those to some of the organizations, the local organizations and national entities that provide donor advised fund services. And then the last slide just has contact information and a reminder, if you're interested in looking back a little, the information is still really helpful from prior years as well. And encourage you to take a look and let others know if you know anyone who missed this. So with that, I think unless there's no further questions, we will close out the evening. And thank you so much to the fantastic panelists and to everybody who's just doing everything they can to make Micah so fantastic. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Good night, good to see you all.
Good night. Thank you, panelists. Well done.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Well done.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
All right, well done.
All right, I'm going to stop recording. Yay.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Oren. That was